Dear friends, sisters, vagabonds, battle deviants, and those who are fighting for a free Ukraine, and those who are interested in the essence of this world and curious to look into different processes, welcome to Alpha and Omega live stream. We have two pretty top-level guests. To the left of me is Olexiy Arestovych, that probably needs no introduction. Most of you know her already. Some people actually say they see him during their dreams. And on the other side, I have Israel ambassador in Ukraine, Michael Brodsky, his first time on our show. Glad to see you here. So we took a subject, Ukraine as Israel of the Eastern Europe, because in that connotation it does start to come up pretty often. Ukraine, on the contrary, is not really doing much to be closer to what Israel is, but I think it is important for us to understand what does it mean to be in Israel, what does it mean to play like an Israel on the global stage. And after the beginning of this war, there are definitely some sore spots between Ukraine and Israel, and we'll try to look into that and see how to overcome them. At the same time, I sincerely think that, and I did speak about that even 7 years ago, that Israel path is very attractive for Ukraine, and I think at some point, sooner or later, we'll get to that. Probably with our own deviations, our own designs, but we likely will end up in the same general direction. Let's start with you, Olexiy, in your understanding. What should we do, or how do you recognize, how do you describe Israeli way? I think their way is simple. People in Israel decided that they want to survive. And people in Ukraine are still deciding if they want to. So back in the day, it was less than 1 million people in the enclave. People did not even call it Israel back then. And at the time, they were hit by 5 Arabic armies and 1 Arabic legion with a goal to destroy them all. And they did understand at that moment that if they do not survive, they just had fresh experience from Holocaust and a Second World War, that they'll be done. And Israel back then was basically a chain of enclaves not really well connected with each other. Reference back in the day to those bus raids by Bedouins on Israel. But the whole country became a military camp. 1 million people enlisted. And from the very beginning, they started to display an amazing rationality and ingenuity that we did not necessarily represent in Ukraine at the moment. They basically started to analyze that they need to find a way to survive, and when they realized that they do not have any good solution except for miraculous, they went for miraculous. And in essence, it's basically a mobilized type of economy that serves certain military goals, and they're still surviving. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think Israel is still has military martial law enacted. It is the only democracy in the Middle East. They have their own medicine, biotech, space programs, and Michael can talk more about that. But I want to talk about unpopular part of it that not many people discuss. They suppressed things that prohibited them or prevented them from development. They suppressed extremism. To a big degree, it was a right-side extremism, and they do have special services, and probably the smartest, the brightest of them are working on that side to make sure to suppress that. And second of all, they did not let Israel to fall down into that chauvinistic hatred, psychosis. Just look at how Ukraine met Dmitry Bykov, one of the Russian opposition representatives recently, I thought we are falling into a really bad tendency. Basically, when there was a decision to choose between Israel-Poland-Kiev and Israel, let's say, who blew up King David. So yeah, Israel of Einstein of King David, they did pick the smarter one to pick, basically to walk between Scylla and Charybdis on the left and on the right, did not fall into the right extremism, into the left socialism, and the strengths and personalities that represented both sides were so authoritative that they had full opportunity to tear the country apart. And we in Ukraine cannot seem to define if we're smart or beautiful, because right now we're picking between Ukraine of Bandera and Ukraine of Skovoroda. I'm definitely for Ukraine of Skovoroda, but when we suppress discussion, when we suppress freedoms, we fall into Bandera's side. And he's a hero, he's a leader, etc. But when we suppress conversation and fall into the path of chauvinism and strong leadership, this basically is cutting out the additional influence from the outside, looking inside, and just following our own weird constructs inside. So just this March we left the 400-year-old archetype of victimhood, and there are people trying to pull us back into that Ukraine as eternal hearse, complaining that everybody is hurting us. And Israel managed to not do that. So this is probably more interesting for me to see how did Israel hold themselves and not fall into one side or another. I think at that time Israel was just becoming a government, but they made a decision that they will not be a victim, that they will defend themselves with weapons in their hands. So yeah, every analogy is not exactly right, but like comparison of Ukraine with Holocaust is maybe not exactly right, but comparison of Ukraine war with the War of Independence and the War of Judgment Day, there's definitely a lot of similarities in that comparison. But one still needs to warn from using copy-paste approach in this case, because Ukraine is a different country, has different geographic position, different neighbors, different population. So I would say you can take some of it. I do not want to idealize Israel here, but some things are definitely, there are some commonalities, and I think Ukraine could benefit if they took it and tried to adapt it and use them in their own style on the Ukraine land. And what these things are, I think there are three major spots worth noting. First of all, whatever it costs, preserve democracy at all costs. And Israel, regardless that it was always surrounded by enemies, there was always a risk of terrorism, and there was always a risk to fall into totalitarianism. And somehow, probably miraculously, Israel prevented that tendency. That did not happen. Another very traumatic event was a murder of a prime minister, where they really were tempted to tighten all the bolts, and it did not happen because of the internal power of the Israel society. And I wonder if that is probably something that is in the Jewish national character, that pluralism, that relentless discussion, not following for one single leader. Yeah, one needs to understand that discussions like we had here on this channel yesterday for 3 hours, many people are saying that you're arguing so rough, but this is, I think, is good. And yeah, I agree with you, this is pretty good. In Israel, people do argue harshly, but at the same time we're trying to stay civil. That after the argument, we can actually walk out of the hall, hug each other as good friends, and continue talking and walking. And I understand that in Israel, an argument with God actually is equivalent to a prayer. To a degree, yes, it is. And that's probably part of Israel character, that it's all right to argue, it's all right to question, it's all right to have difference of opinion. And one more point is to rely just on yourself. Get ready for any eventuality, but rely just on yourself. Yeah, I think we're lacking that in Ukraine now. We did get some help in Israel back in the 48, back in the Judgment Day War. But in general, we did not expect that help. We were basically thinking we are our help. And eventually we became powerful enough to be able to pull off our defense without much help from outside. Another thing is that our diaspora is an asset for the country. It is everywhere in the world, and it is definitely a big asset. Yeah, in Ukraine we did lose quite a bit of population, but yeah, diaspora anyway, they form your connections with other countries. This is your connection to the world. At the end, diaspora makes Ukraine stronger, just like ours makes our country stronger. Israel actually was relying on Israel diaspora in the world. That we did rely on that, and it did help to attract investments, it did help to attract contracts, it did help to promote certain high-tech programs. There is a statement I want to interject here, that in Ukraine people are saying in order to be like Israel we need to not have corruption as in Israel. And in my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, but Israel does not necessarily not have corruption. True, we are not clean in this department. We do have some. It is different. It's not so, it's not even measurable with corruption that we know from the recent history in the Eastern Europe. It's not even a corruption in this case. It's more of a corruption of connections, corruption of friends, and this way. So, and we actually have tradition that our prime ministers, some of them were investigated. President was actually in prison. Not necessarily all for corruption. One of them went there for sex crimes. But I think personally that a country that cannot start a criminal case against prime minister is not free. It's not a democracy. Another thing that people don't realize about Israel is that in Knesset right now you have basically Islamist parties. I would call them Arabic parties, not necessarily Islamist, but one of them actually is part of the governmental coalition. Also in Israel, in universities, there are so left professors that they would not let a soldier in uniform to their lecture. These professors do critique a lot Israel politics. There are also ultra-Orthodox people in Israel who even question the necessity of Israel's existence, yet at the same time they receive government subsidies for their life. Nobody is at the same time fainting and trying to destroy the other side. Like in Ukraine, some people arguing want to say that you need to push out the opponent, you don't need to let him exist. When in Israel they did manage to overcome that. There's another good thing in Israel. People actually gather together when there is a threat. Oh yeah, we do have that in Ukraine. But I think in Ukraine we probably should just pick an empty area somewhere on the outskirts of Kiev and shell it every other day so that people would jump a little and still stay more connected. Stay together and focused on fighting the issues, because otherwise, they just relax and go back into arguing. It is similar somewhat. In Israel, we argue all the time. We only get together when there is a serious threat to our lives, and then we get together and get rid of a threat first. I think out of all you said is that really main issue seems to be the one that we cannot fully or do not seem to be fully ready to rely on our own skill. We always look for help from Poland, from overseas, from somewhere else to help us deal with the problem. I also want to interject here that when they say that Ukraine can become or should become Israel, I think people also mean that Ukraine should develop science, culture, partake in different international programs, just like Israel does. And Israel is capable of achieving good financial success, despite the fact that we keep fighting with terrorism, that we have a very high percent of our budget going to fight attacks and different terrorist acts. What's the percent of GDP going to that military stuff? It's about 4%. It's way more than in Europe. Oh yeah. NATO standards is what, 2%? At least 2, yes. There is one other difference. Israel does not have a strategic depth, and Israel yet has military production. That's one of the conversations in Ukraine. Why, if there is no place that is safe from Russian caliber missile, why even build military facilities? Because, one missile and it's gone. It's just a waste of money. At the same time, Israel doesn't have any depth, so that it's about 90 miles in the wide place. So, and yet they managed to develop a very good defense program and production. Yeah, well, we actually did build the Iron Dome and other tools. Iron Dome is what, 1/5 of your complex? That's true, that's a part of it. But it's also probably not scalable to be used in Ukraine. I want to say that our Iron Dome copes pretty well with certain sectors, and you should probably comment why it would not work on Ukraine. Yeah, indeed, it would not work in Ukraine, because in Israel we have an angle of about 45 degrees where we expect the attacks to come from. In Ukraine, it's a much wider sphere, or half a sphere, almost like 180, where the missiles can go flying. Another reason is that in case of Israel, those missiles those Qassam missiles being shot at them are pretty dumb. When in Russia, Ukraine theater, Russian missiles have some chips that make them much smarter than that, so much harder to intercept. I remember it very well when back in '91 I just moved to Israel, and Israel was being attacked by Scuds, those USSR-made missiles, and back in the day, Patriot systems helped us a lot because they really saved us with that. They could withstand those attacks. Probably Ukraine could use some of that kind of equipment because, they are capable of intercepting fast-flying ballistic objects. So, regarding Bykov, that comment that Olexiy said, do you have an example of Arab oppositioner who might have come to Israel and tried to teach them how to live? I don't know, there probably is one. I just don't think that anyone will sweat about it. Let's take a look at the Israel parliament. You just listen to some of their oppositions, you will be horrified the way they're blaming Israel for everything. Because our images in Israel, there are patrols with, machine guns and all, and if you misbehave, you get shot immediately. No. Over that, in parliament, you can see amazing borderline terrorist speeches. Or you can find professors who's still a professor in a university and who is hating everything that's Israel doing. The level of acceptance in Israel is amazing indeed, but we do differentiate between speech and action. For speech, for whatever you say, you cannot take any of his rights away, even if he's pushing a speech on a high level of parliament. But for actions, there definitely are consequences. So depending upon what they do, rights can be taken away. That's, I think, where we should go as well, because that's the border between power, force, and freedom. You should not punish somebody for thoughts and speeches. If somebody comes out and says, I think Russia is good, Russia is doing good, we should join them and fight against West, and we should not be able to do anything about him. But the moment he or she takes weapons and starts doing something, even if he's swearing that he loves Ukraine doing that, or speaks only in Ukrainian, then he immediately gets in front of a judge and has to face criminal punishment. And that would be the right way in my mind. Not many people like it. In Israel, there are people also objecting that there are absolutely anti-Israel speeches in the parliament. Yeah, indeed. When I actually just heard of it, I thought this cannot happen in any country, because basically in Israel, the congressman can come up and say, you all are idiots and you all should surrender. And that's fine. And they don't get punished for that. Everybody is, some people even applaud these people, these candidates and congressmen, but the moment they try to do something, actual action, then things do change. Then they have to face the wrath of Israel criminal law. There is a good series, Fauda, Israel-based. Yeah, we sad that war interrupted that. We were ready to shoot the 4th season in Ukraine, already agreed on different things, and now we couldn't, of course. So speaking of that, this series, how close to real life that is? Well, if you don't take some nuance bloopers, in general, the series do reflect the spirit of Israel Special Forces. There are special detachments, so to say, pseudo-Arabs, people, our special forces, who pretend to be on the Arabic side. Not all of them speak perfect Arabic, they just look alike, and they're being sent to certain special ops. This work exists, it's been done by different special services. We have Shabak, we have military intel, and we do not have that in Ukraine. It's a little easier for you, because you guys even look alike, right? Right, I know. I heard on the Russian side they do have a similar system. They do, yeah, a lot. Back in the early days of war, they used special services from Yanukovych regime who spoke Ukrainian, who knew our ins and outs. They used them to try to attack VIP persons. Yes. So you did mention another aspect, some roughness in the discussion. No, I meant actual chauvinism. Well, okay, listen to me. I want to address the roughness in terms of yourself and the communication. I think Israel has that roughness in the way they discuss things. They have very small operative depth, so they always play a game for all or nothing. And eventually it became sort of a government system, government approach in Israel. And it also became a problem in a way, because in the neighboring countries, Israel is not exactly liked. Any of the Arabic countries, I did not see any love. I would disagree with you, actually, because these days the situation is changing. Because first of all, maybe they won't tell you up front that they like Israel or love Israel. But on a certain level, we know that they do have appreciation for Israel, and they do want to be somewhat like Israel. I'm not even talking about, countries like Jordan and the others, several whom we had good relations with. But these years, look at us, we're concluding contracts about diplomatic relations with others whom we could not even talk before, even with Saudi Arabia, with which we do not have official relations. At some point we'll get to diplomatic relations with them. It's improving. So another question that flows out of our previous discussion. Do you think Israel can already make plans for integration in the region? And This might be specifically important in light of American post-Middle East policies, that United States are indeed leaving the region. They're doing it gradually. They're not doing it abruptly all at once, but they're trying to reallocate some of the responsibility onto other countries like Egypt, Israel, what they're being called American air carrier in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. So Israel has a new strategic situation, probably a new one to come up in the last several decades. So Israel had previously a paradigm that they could have called United States as a last call, and US would come rushing on a cavalry helping and saving them. These days you start to understand that may not necessarily happen, and how do you comment that? Well, our relations with the United States are still important. I would still want to say that they are acting in a select manner. Some things get more attention, some things get less attention, but Middle East is changing rapidly indeed. Today, after we have signed peace accords and agreements with diplomatic relations with the countries of the Gulf, countries of the north of Africa, Israel is really a part of Middle East, first of all in economic sense, because our economies are complementary to each other. Arabic countries of the Gulf got Israel technology, and we got access to colossal investments which are coming now from the Gulf countries, Emirates, Bahrain, and countries like that. That's the first interest, and second is Iran. We all of our group equally, probably countries of the Gulf are more cautious about Iran, and we all are afraid of Iran becoming a nuclear country. That will definitely change the composition of powers. So we did find a good common language with Gulf countries. They see a very big threat in Iran for their stability, for the peace in the Middle East. And we've been having these contacts for many years. It's been public. We actually had our representatives there for a long time. Some people work there as businessmen, others as attaché and tourism. We've been meeting in third countries before, but now we can talk about it openly. So then the question, on the level of elites, Israel and Gulf countries are making friendship pretty easy. If anything, everything is maybe too easy on the elite levels, because you guys find common language, common games to play together, common interests. But regarding the common folk, I'm just talking about my personal experience when I was in Jordan, and you meet a lot of people from Palestine, extradited from Palestine, or who fled. I'm not talking about Syria, but that's another conflict. I've been to Saudi Arabia also. Very specific attitude to Israel on the lower levels of society. So elites level can create such a shiny, warm feeling that everything is good. But when the problem of food appears, for example, when the countries cannot get Ukrainian grain and bread for whatever reason, then political regimes start to topple one after another, and all these old problems that are brooding within each society will start to bubble up. Of course, there is always a risk. A peace between Israel and all the countries of the Gulf was always a peace of elites. It unfortunately has never become truly a peace of populace. It's a bit more difficult on that level because there is definitely an Islamic factor that precludes us getting closer. There's a cultural factor. And this is the danger of authoritarian, non-democratic countries when rising prices on food or other items can lead to toppling the regime, to change the regime in the country. So same situation when prices on fuel go up, that can all lead to social unrest and to people taking it out to the streets, and as a result it can become very unstable, like in Sri Lanka, Tunisia, Sudan. We can keep naming different countries. What can we see in Israel? If you start talking to Israelites, you can see the speed of their thought. I wonder if that's probably a reason just that they are positioned between a lot of different threats, that they evolved into thinking fast, which we are kind of missing here in Ukraine. Over there, I guess, if you don't calculate prices on bread or other crises coming around, you may miss seriously. I would want to say that hot phase in Middle East usually lasts from several days to several weeks tops. Unfortunately, with Ukraine and Russia, that is very different. Well, yeah, we do have a huge territory, and plus Middle East is generally a desert. In Israel, you realize that in Middle East, you realize that water determines everything. If you have no water, you're done. So most of fighting is happening around water, around oases, around cross-sections and intersections that lead to waterways. Yep, 1966 was one of the wars that actually had water as one of its goals. These days, Israel actually installed a lot of new technology, and we're being more rational, more high-tech. We using a lot of reclaimed water for technical needs. We desalinate. We do a lot of things that were very impossible before. We kind of allowed technological advance. And Israel's influence now into Africa, Israel spreading into Africa, is it a strategic position or not? We always were interested in spreading our influence into that area. The main direction of our economic expansion these days is Africa and Asia. Southeast Asia is number one, and there are other countries like Singapore, Vietnam. We have very special relations with Singapore. They actually are building their army based on Israel model. So we still have very special relations with Singapore. And in Africa, it's mostly our help to Africa, because the Agency for Humanitarian Help was created in Israel after Golda Meir visited African countries, and she said that she hasn't seen anything like that before. So we do need to try to help them. And of course, first of all, it's help. Secondary, we do hope that there'll be some reciprocity on the back. And in some countries it worked. Our relations are good, and others didn't add much score to us. But people in Africa do know Israel. They do know our water desalination technologies, and it does bring some income to our business as well, because first it's humanitarian. We help the society to uplift itself, and then businessmen get new markets, new opportunities to work together. So a question from one of the viewers. I don't know if Ambassador knows the answer to that, but is there a system that allows investors and new businesses to get any additional support or any bonuses if they're trying to build their business in a socially unstable part of Israel? Yes, if you are building that near sector Gaza or some other place like that, you definitely get different treatment in case of taxes, in case of support, different preferential treatment. There was an interesting story when Israel left sector Gaza, and there were some agricultural facilities there We're hoping that Hamas may take our facilities and bring their people and actually make business and grow crops, but instead they just brought their missile sites there and brought their people to shoot missiles at us. So for them, unfortunately, war is business. These days, you mentioned that Israel is closer with China, but does it reflect in any way on your relations with the United States? Because there is definitely some tension between them. Since America actually did mention that Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine are islands of liberty in the world, in the difficult spots, and Israel is trying to get closer with China to find mutual interests, but we still keep United States as our main ally. So we often discuss things together with the United States before we do anything military related with China, and we sometimes decide against going into some things. But as for general economic industries, it's not an issue. There may be some issues with letting Chinese strategic money into our strategic industries. Chinese workers, not really. We don't care about workers much. I mean, they work already. They already help us build things. But in letting Chinese money to help us build rail stations, seaports, or get natural resources, there are certain risks there. We understand that it may not be that well aligned with strategic interests of the country. Michael, I have a question. How does the system of recognition of your strategic interests work in Israel? That's a good question, very good question. Where is it formed? Which parts? I think like in every democratic country, it's not really formed in single source, single spot. It's probably some sort of triangle between the power, society as a whole, and some academic institutes or think tanks that influence that agenda and create that agenda. As a result, Prime Minister and Cabinet are responsible for it. Our government is in charge of all the external politics. Knesset is an organ that can criticize and ask questions, but Knesset is checking with people outside of political systems. So expert society, expert community is pretty developed. It is, at the same time, it's very one-sided in a way, because Israel, although superpower, it's a very regional superpower, because our interests are mostly related to Middle East. That may be partly explaining why Israel is not so actively involved in what's happening in Ukraine. There's a lot of critics yelling at Israel for not participating and to a higher degree. But Israel is not a European country, and we're in Middle East, and we're also sitting on a powder keg. I think it's unfair to criticize Israel in this regard, because Israel right now has military activity in Gaza. Your guys are surviving terrorist activities on a daily basis. We also have military operations in Syria and in Iran. Oh yeah, we also have new elections. And you also have a very complex system of relations with the Russian Federation, which has a big influence strategically in that region. So one should not just expect Israel to take weapons and deliver them to Ukraine, as some people in Ukraine would hope. We'll go over that question in more detail. I'm turning to those who are watching us live. Don't be bad people, please click the like button, because you do like to post different things and criticize us, but in order to do that, you need to click that like button. That gives you a right to criticize us. So please leave your likes, and it helps us to promote this show to Other people on YouTube, do you want to show that stream to other good people? Leave your like, important. Alright, now let's go to Russia and Ukraine. And I have a question. Do people understand in Israel that right now what Russia is doing in Ukraine, it is pushing it in the very toxic corner where it will be shunned by most of the countries. States are already forming their new policies again about Russia. Europe is already preparing, looking for ways to prepare for being cut off from Russian natural gas. Germany cut the usage of Russian gas from 40 to 25%. They're reviving their coal industry, their nuclear industry. Poland is supporting their own coal mining to solve that issue. So Europe is going, it's not even some chaotic motions, it's really a strategy that one can see if you know where to look. NATO is making decision that Russia is the first-tier enemy. China is on the background somewhere because Russia is taking the lead. And that role that Russia is playing in Israel politics probably will be reviewed as well. So Israel, unlike the countries of Europe, until 2015, did not really depend upon Russia. We really depended upon Soviet Union because Soviet Union had a lot of support for Arab nations, and we needed to have a channel of communication with Soviet Union. Russia came back to Middle East in 2015 when there was that issue with Syria. It was basically a day when we woke up, looked out of the window, and all of a sudden there is Russian army out there. So we were not prepared for that, and we needed to find ways to cope with it. Today, Russia is an important player in the Middle East who is defining a lot of rules and a lot of processes happening, and we are dependent upon processes happening in the countries around us. The question of security and safety of our soldiers and citizens is very serious for us. We're treating that as a top serious issue. If you remember, in 2015, our Prime Minister Netanyahu flew directly to Moscow after Russia brought their troops to Syria, because Israel wanted to discuss it with Kremlin to make sure that we do have a degree of freedom in our actions in Syria, because we need to curb the possible terrorist activities, and we're also concerned about Iran's presence in Syria. So there is a channel of communication that we work, there is some coordination. I wouldn't even call it coordination, it's more of a communication channel. And there were hundreds of thousands of people who moved to Israel from Russia. And in Russia itself, there is a huge Jewish community. According to different estimates, it's from 500,000 to about 1 million people living there who have rights to come back to Israel. So Israel should not be cutting our connections with Russia, because that would mean that we'll cut off that Jewish community, and it'll be a very serious blow on our strategic interests in the region. Alright, right now there is a different situation forming though. When Russia is starting to leave Syria, it's not leaving like some people paint it. First of all, they've never kept too big of a group there. Russia moved several tens of thousands of troops through Syria over the years. It had never kept 10,000 people there at one time. But we do see that they are withdrawing everything they can. They're trying to consolidate and bring back the troops they can throw into theater in Ukraine. They even took some from Tajikistan, from Armenia border. So in Syria there will be a vacuum if Russia leaves, and Iran will be filling it. For us it will be bad news, because if that vacuum will be filled with Iranians, we'll have to do other actions, probably more hard actions. And Mikhail finally said something that some people don't understand. that Israel has to choose between Russia and Iran. And Russia does never claim that they will destroy Israel, but Iran actually do claim that they want to destroy Israel. But that creates an opportunity for Russia to keep you on a hook, right? In a certain way, because we see that every time Israel hits Syria somewhere, Russia is making a set of statements. You shouldn't be doing that. This is a wrong approach. And we understand that since Soviet times, Russians do have channels to supply weapons to Hamas and to other groups that you have certain situations from time to time. So I want to say that the potential of damage that Russia can do to Israel in the Middle East is colossal. This is a big problem indeed. But I still want to say that Israel is not really being shy when they need to clank their teeth and growl. Even with the Soviet times, Israel did shoot a few Russian pieces of equipment when they had to. But today as well, whenever Israel needs to address something, they are not shy. When Israel is pushed to the wall, they will be defending, they'll be acting even against Russia. Of course, that's always on the table. There was an episode, remember, when IL-20 was shot. Syrian S-200 operators were badly trained and they shot Russian communication plane, IL-20. Let's be delicate and say that Israel plane was not there, but Syrian did pin that on the Israeli jet, saying that it distracted them and they shot a different plane. But yeah, coming back to the fact that Israel will act actively whenever they need to. We do have a ton of threats, a ton of issues, so we're not looking to create new problems, but we can address the existing ones. We probably should also mention another thing, that Israel society always had pretty difficult relations with Ukrainian society. Petlura, Bandera, other things historically. But this war allowed us to flip the page to a new stage that allows us to reset the earlier issues that we had before, the earlier upsets that we had about each other. Because Israeli support for Ukraine is pretty high right now, and we should be using it because this is a good chance for us to rebuild our relations. Same as with Poles. When the war started, they said, let's forget Volyn, let's forget all the qualms we had before that. We have an opportunity to rebuild it now. I should confirm, yes, we should not forget what happened. Right, forgetting and not disturbing is another thing. Right. We can disagree about some things in the past, about politics and stuff, and giving certain ranks and certain street names, voting in United Nations against Israel, right? I actually have to say that Ukraine generally was supportive of Israel in United Nations. We cannot say that Ukraine is always against Israel. Same as Israel was supportive of Ukraine, and during the last war we not only voted to support Ukraine, but we also authored the resolution that was condemning Russian aggression. And yeah, you guys actually had quite a bit of upsets because of that decision. Yes, we did, but we still stuck to the guns. And we do march against war, against aggression. We are calling things what they are. Alright, so on the early stage of war in Ukraine, there was a position formed that highlighted these general values that threw pretty deep shadow on our relations with Israel. So one can say that there is a position of Israel society where we see the volunteer activity, people supporting us, and this is a lot, this is a plenty, and this is great. And then there is a position of Israel government which is concerned about not crossing certain red lines. I think that's normal, even though that separation between society and government is artificial. Both society and the government do support Ukraine, and we try to support it in those capabilities where we can. The difference is that society doesn't need to think strategically. They can allow to express sympathy right now, and government has to think about the future strategic things and safety of the government, safety of the country, safety of society. Because if they miscalculate, society will be there asking them these questions. And in a good country, government will ask these questions of themselves, of course. And yeah, it's true though, we do our sympathies are with Ukraine. So in the days preceding the war, when did you realize that, when you got the signal that everything will be that hard, that harsh, that rough, and how did you see Ukraine perspective in that aspect? What was your estimate about our holding time? How long do you think we would be able to hold against Russia? I'll tell you something. Maybe you didn't know, but Israel doesn't have our own intel sources in that region. Seriously? You're laughing, but we sincerely do not have. And we rely on Brits and rely on Americans who give us a lot of data about the region. So our legend about Israel's special services and Israel's special services are two different things. No, our special services are very good in the Middle East. We're good at tracking the terrorism and all that stuff and immediate threats. But as for further out, since we're regional, we were tracking only based on the UK and US reports who were sending us their intel. So we've been holding to the end. We evacuated the embassy 3 days before the war started. The decision to evacuate was taken at very late that day when we moved them out. At 11 p.m. we decided that at midnight we'll be leaving. And we looked at Putin's statement, and his intonation was the thing that told us. It was not really the words, it was the intonation. And there were two things. He did call for LNR and DNR to become recognized republics, and that was part of it. Yes, it was. So we had bags in our trunks, and we were trying to be quick. We did not know for how long we were leaving. If I knew, I probably would have taken both suitcases, but we were hoping to be back in a couple of weeks, but it did happen to be different. The decision about evacuation was being made at the level of Prime Minister. In 15 minutes from my call to Director of Minister of Foreign Affairs, he called a couple more contacts, and then Prime Minister got a call and got back to us on that decision. That all in 15 minutes. So we moved to Lvov first and then to Poland. And since then we've been coming to Kiev. We're trying to be here at maximum, but we still operate out of both Kiev and Poland. We still have a lot of citizens in Ukraine. Before the war, we had about 10,000 Israelites here, now a bit less, but still. Our people are different. Despite us warning them and telling them to leave and advising, most people were blaming us, and they were telling us there'll be no war, get off our backs. As a result, when the war started, all 10,000 were calling our embassy and screaming, "Where's our plane that'll evacuate us?" when the airspace was already closed. So at the end, they went to the border one way or another. Many people were given documents that they didn't have because they were really packing in a hurry. Nobody really thought that war would be possible up until several days before it. So when you saw what was happening in Ukraine, when you understood that those scenarios that you've been drawing with the Western intel, and Ukrainian army decided to actually fight and resist, although Alexei may probably be able to tell more stories about how did we fight back and what fearing circumstances we managed to win. When you were watching that one, did you realize that Ukraine will hold? I would not conceal that. We thought Ukraine maybe will be able to hold for 2 to 3 days. Us meaning our military, our experts society. I remember Israeli generals who said that how can you compare Russian army with Ukraine army? So when a week passed, a second week passed, we got the light bulb going on that, oh, Ukraine will actually survive. Ukraine managed to mobilize and to push back the first aggression. And then the war goes into a very different way than most experts suggested it would. And then in Israel, we started treating Ukraine differently, and I understand it was paid by a huge price of civil and military lives and destruction of infrastructure and the work that you'll have to do after the war. It's even difficult for me to value that in time and space because it's a colossal work on rebuilding the country. And not just physical rebuilding, but also psychological rebuilding. And reviving all the systems and healthcare, education, other systems of the country. I sincerely hope Israel will be able to partake in that. And I also hope that by that time Israel can come and will be able to partake and help, especially what's related to healthcare. Our healthcare system is very good, some of the best doctors, best medicine, so we'll be glad to partake. By the way, Israeli companies also suggested their consulting services to Ukrainian citizens, and that's why most of our humanitarian support is in this plane. Yeah, the hospital, you guys basically sent us a mobile hospital or transporting your people to Israel to treat. Equipment, consulting, we'll continue doing that and we'll keep increasing the volume. So Israel indeed helped a lot with medicine, if anybody doesn't know. Do you know another good influence of your presence in our cast? This is one of the few casts where Romanenko and Arestovych do not use expletives, probably because they are respecting the visitor too much. That's what we see in the chat. There probably is no topic, I guess, yet, no subject to use that lexicon. And I did have to ban one person. Do not write stupid, idiotic stuff there. Do not troll, because I have no opportunity to. I barely have time to read good questions, so when somebody goes into wild tangents, I just block that. So one thing is when people asking you about certain politics-related questions, I can make a separate stream with Arestovych about that, and he can turn red and answer all these questions. I won't turn red. I will answer the way I know. They're funny. They think there are questions that we're afraid of. There are none. All right, so regarding Israel. I thought of this question and somebody already suggested it here in the chat. So how can we then comment on the discriminatory statement by Ministry of Internal Affairs of Israel in regards to some of our citizens? I think this was a mistake, and it's good that our court fixed that mistake, which tells again that we are a democracy and there are ways to correct wrong decisions made by the government. I think that mistake was made in panic because somebody in Israel decided that 8 million or 20 million of Ukrainians will all come to Israel. Of course, we understand this is not going to happen this way. Israel is not the first country of choice, not even the third country of choice for Ukrainian refugees unless they have some Jewish blood. Israel is a country far away. This is the country that doesn't really give any benefits for refugees. We're the country that was always taking Jewish refugees. In Israel, since the beginning of this war, we had about 30,000 people who came over. Maybe only 10 of them who had a status and got the right to work and immediately and could integrate in society immediately. The other 20,000, they basically have their support network within their families. Yeah, it's not so easy to get to Israel, and also from the standpoint of safety, it's not exactly a good choice to go from one place to another where there is some risks. I would say, yeah, right now we're probably better than Ukraine, but we're still living on the powder keg, so it is a difficult decision for many. But I still think that in regards to Israeli image and public relations, that decision was a mistake. So now when this decision has been cancelled, we can put a dot in this because we got back to the situation before the war. Michael is very delicate in his position. People in Israel knows that Israel Ministry of Internal Affairs is a very harsh ministry. And it's not just Ukrainians that they relate this way to. They're like this to everybody, to African immigrants, to any other immigrant from any other country. And by the way, there is a story about several thousand Ukrainians who came back in the day, and they were illegal and they caused some social issues for us, especially for our size, and we don't really know how to deal with that right or easy. So Israel took a position that it's easier to not let people come and then deal with circumstances. Even though it was a faulty decision. And you know, that's how they check the luggage, that's how they check visitors, tourists from Ukraine. There have been people complaining about that. So this is kind of a norm for them. So we have Uman approaching in September. And I'm in Kiev now to actually discuss how things will be happening, because despite that my colleague in Israel said that this year there will be no Uman, there will be Uman, they will come. Oh, I'm not even concerned that they won't come. It's impossible to stop these people. These are pretty specific people. But those people who come, those several tens of thousands, these are the ones for whom the visit to Uman on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, is one of the most heroic things they can do during that year. And the more difficult it was to get there, the higher the value of getting it. So the more hurdles, barriers you put in front of them, the more giddy they'll be overcoming them. So the right way to see that is not to stop them. It's even the threat of a direct nuclear attack will not stop them. You just need to find a way to ease the logistics. You remember how a few years ago they got together in Belarus and tried to go by swamps and forests to get to Uman despite of all the COVID restrictions and closed borders. So they'll find ways to come. They can come through Moldova, Poland, Romania, other countries. If there'll be protection right in front, there'll be a restriction right in front of the new year. They'll come a bit earlier. So yeah, you just cannot stop that. You can only regulate it, direct it rather. So I have two comments in this regard. One is serious, I think, another is God knows what. So first is probably an easy way to break the whole Russian sentiment that there are some neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Just give the picture of these tens of thousands people coming from, Israel or Jewish all over the world, coming to that place. That just showing that, casting that picture will be one of the strongest hit on Putin's propaganda about some mythic Nazis in Ukraine. When I was asked several times by media about Nazis in Ukraine, I'm not even smiling anymore. This is ridiculous. Yeah, there are usual anti-Semites like in every other country, in Russia, in States, in France. There are extreme rights or extreme lefts, but it's a normal country. And the other one is that Ukraine could send a secret signal to these people that for every 10 of you coming, if you bring a Bayraktar with you or something like that, you will get a special corridor to your place of destination. They usually bring other things. They usually bring things more related to the holiday. But I forgot how it is in Latin, but times change and we change with them. So there was a question in the chat, does Mr. Ambassador think that maybe Israel is making a mistake but not supplying certain types of weapons to Ukraine? Well, those who don't do anything never make mistakes. Everybody else do make mistakes. The problem is that the moment the moment Israel sends anything of meaning to Ukraine, Russia will send some ammo to Hezbollah and will set Israel on fire as well. And this may cause Israel lives as well to be paid for Ukraine getting more weapons. With all the sympathy we have for Ukraine, I'm afraid the lives of our people is on the forefront, so we have to be very careful. Our people are also hiding in bomb shelters from time to time, and we did survive several wars. We have to deal with the enemy that is stronger than us, or used to be stronger than us at different times. So we do understand what Ukraine is living through now, and we probably shouldn't even ask for any understanding from Ukraine when they're being shelled and attacked by Russia. But there'll be some understanding later that Ukraine will get Israel's situation too. I want to say that people in Ukraine don't necessarily understand the difficulty of Israel. With all the stuff going on in Israel, their life is hanging on a thread. We lost certain part of our country, like 25-30%. We are still fighting. We are still holding the line. We're still striking back. In Israel, if they capture 25% of the country, they're done. In '75, when some of the tanks got to during the war through Israel military, Israel was hanging by a thread. So if Russia feeds certain weapons to Hezbollah and Hezbollah starts shelling Israel, Israel will have to pay a lot more money to try to stop that offensive. So immediately there'll be fires in Sector Gaza. There is a risk of getting Iran in that war, either by proxy or directly. And this is a house of cards that people in Ukraine don't realize Israel is part of. And that responsibility for the lives of not just Israeli soldiers and civilians, but also regional war that may change everything in the region. So you have to behave very responsibly. So I'm reading some commentary here about Hasid Jews that people are listening, and they said that Israel might supply Iron Dome to Uman, and perhaps move it with them, and maybe let them go to Uman through Kharkiv. So in the meantime, they could add additional protection. So Iron Dome unfortunately is not a universal tool. And while it is a good thing for us locally in Israel, it is a very niche weapon. It will not be able to stop ballistic missiles flying. It's a very border-based, geography-based solution for certain type of missiles, but it cannot solve a global problem. It cannot solve Ukrainian issue. So, does Israel plan to take Ukrainian troops? Do we have any plans for Israel to train Ukrainian troops? I think the answer is obvious, but still want to ask. We heard, I'm kind of keeping an eye on that, but I haven't heard anything about training. There are some plans to give some helmets and some protective gear for minesweepers, and even that was questioned initially. Right now, we are at agreement that yes, we can supply this items. I can only say that there are some things that we don't know and we shouldn't be talking about, so perhaps there is something going, but we'll never know. Not until the war is over, at least. So there are other questions about infrastructure. Let's not even take military weapons, but maybe has Ukraine turned to Israel, to Israeli companies, to maybe help us build some of the military infrastructure? Because it is one of the key issues for Ukraine to build military infrastructure for development and production, just like Israel was developing their own technologies on their own infrastructure. And I'm quite sure that perhaps some months later, or probably even before this war is over, we'll have to initiate a program that will allow us to build our own anti-air system. There was some interest, not during the war, but for the last several years. There were some companies trying to enter the market, and Israeli companies have a lot of questions about how to optimize that process and that cooperation. But I'm quite sure that there is a lot of opportunity for cooperation and opportunities to localize production in the Ukraine. It's just during the war, nobody's going to be investing and doing that. But after the war, of course, that's a very valid topic for discussion. So I'm trying to see if there is any exclusivity they're asking about in the chat. Please clarify what you're talking about so I can rephrase your question. Otherwise, it is not too obvious what you're asking. If you're asking if Israel can also concentrate on reviving or rebuilding certain branches of the industry, I don't know about the military side of things. That may be a bit more complicated. But as far as the medicine is concerned, I'm quite sure we can, to a degree that we can actually rebuild the whole medical system if you need to, including rehabilitation and psychological traumas and all kind of follow-up to take care of the traces left by this conflict. And Israel would be glad to, if not take control of that, but at least participate on par with Ukraine experts to create new system of healthcare, including digital health, telehealth, computerized services, everything that is rather lacking today in Ukraine. Oh, I see what he is asking here. He clarified, and that's the question about including the kids with limitations or limited capabilities, such as Asperger's scale, autism, and stuff. We actually do have a lot of good experience too in this regard. We even can help right now because kids continue to suffer during the war as well, and Israel actually did offer programs to help with autistic kids. So what is your feeling? Where will the world go in the next 6 months or maybe several years? Because on one hand, we see that there are a lot of precursors to a serious economic crisis in Europe that will be based in the energy sector. Ukraine will be a pretty difficult position. At the same time, there are also some issues related to food supply. There are some preliminary agreements from Istanbul, but in general, I'm very skeptical and careful about this matter. So we understand that there may be another Arab Spring coming, because many countries of Middle East, countries like Egypt, which have a lot of lower income population who could be rather mobile. Also, we see COVID making rounds around, and we see World Health Organization is trying to raise awareness. And leading analysts working in Europe and States, they're warning that there may be another big global economic crisis in the world that will be a catalyst for many of these processes. How do you see that from Israel? You know, the last 3 years, coronavirus, war, they kind of taught me not to expect anything good. I do want to be optimistic, but in recent times it has been excessively hard. So right now, after the war, our horizon of planning is probably 1 or 2 weeks. And I wouldn't be daring to prognosticate for a year or two in advance, because people will be coming over and asking, so where are your prognosis now? What happened to that? That's not the good time to do these prognoses. I think in general they're right. There will be a fuel crisis, there will be a food crisis, and the main thing is to adapt as quickly as we can. That's what our famous philosopher Yuval Harari was saying. In the future, one of the main qualities of humans is not even an intellect. It has to be ability to adapt. Should be a number one capacity of a human, Homo sapiens. And the countries that will be able to adapt faster will have it easier. The other countries will have it rougher. Another question. In biblical stories, Israel is sort of in the center of the world story. At the same time, Israel is a secular country with a lot of non-religious people. Does Israel feel its own special mission in the world? I don't think usual Israelis do not feel that special mission amidst the daily routine. And they're worried about economic and other issues that they face daily. Israelis are not walking around with that feeling of a special mission. They're not bringing kids to the daycare with that, yeah, little one, go to the daycare, you have to save the world today, study well. We don't have that. But if Israel can play any positive role, and there were some attempts to somehow aid in negotiations. You remember that Bennett, our back then Prime Minister, he met Putin, he talked to Zelensky, and he suggested that even if we can just give as a negotiation platform Jerusalem or anything, would be glad to, but it is hard to predict if this will happen or not. So Marina is writing here saying that it looks like Russia is being afraid of. I think Mikhail described it proper here. The matter is not fear. I think I wrote an article about that a while ago. There are two great nations in the world. Jews are showing how to do things right, and Ukrainians are showing how to do things wrong. And all the other nations are somewhere between these two poles. So Israel, what Mikhail is saying here is that using mind, using logic to avoid certain problems. So my point is, if we start to using our brains better in Ukraine, we will transform our country to a degree that even Israel will be jealous of us after a while. Israel is just using their head and they're following their interests, which may be different from ours. That's how world politics is set. It doesn't mean that you need to throw plates at each other, break pots, and curse Israel for reluctance to start regional war. And frankly, as an ambassador to Ukraine, this situation does worry me. I don't want to throw the baby out with the water, because we do have good relations between our countries in various industries, and I think after the war, Israel experience, Israel capabilities will be very appreciated in Ukraine after that. So we need to fight, to struggle to maintain our good, friendly relations. Here I think the logic and intellect will win. I did talk to my friends recently, and they did express a thought that Israel needs to understand that the situation that happened in Ukraine after 24th of February, it led to even Ukrainian Jews who live here, they need to distance themselves from politics of Israel. Not because they're threatened or anything, God forbid, no, but because the public opinion actually formed in a different way, that they're more pro-Ukraine than, let's say, Israel is pro-Ukraine. And we need to form a certain conversation here. And yes, we do need to share a lot of data and try to understand each other's point of view. And our people very often are saying, they're like on opposite sides of the same sentence. They're saying that Israel is awesome, but in the same sentence they can also say, well, but they're afraid of Russia, so they suck. And Israel is like a rope walker. They cannot afford to jump and dance around. They need to be very precise in the way they move. But when Israel calculates certain decisions and they will not be shy to implement them. Well, just like Golda Meir said back in the day, we don't have nuclear weapons, but if we have to, we'll use it. So I want to say that if Israel would calculate that they need to shoot down a Russian plane, they will. So, another question, another provocative question. I'll try to see to show how these three columns, history, corruption, and culture, how they all connect together. So here is a question that I got. How do you treat the ambassador? What do you think about our ambassador Melnik in Germany? So I have to address it back to the person asking this question. How would Mikhail's answer correct anything or change anything in the world? Do you think that him saying something about our ambassador there, saying that he supports Bandera or something else and his Ukraine history, that it may somehow change Germany's attitude to supply our arms, while at the same time in Israel there is a new crisis? And yeah, little kids are hiding under the table and being told that it's time to save the world. And Israel goes into another war. So when asking questions, you need to think about what are you trying to achieve with it. This question was a weird one. I want to bring another example as to decision making. In 73, Moroccans added their troops to fight against Israel on the battlefield. And there was actually a Moroccan detachment fighting against Israel. Meanwhile, Israel was still supplying weapons to Morocco and training their officers, while Moroccan troops were fighting against Israel on the battlefield. And Israel in action understood that it's a much longer, much smarter strategy to train their officers and to train how to use them, but at the same time also to use that as an intel opportunity, as an opportunity to get a foot in the door and reestablish relations with that nation for later. Because Morocco was actually fighting in that war only willy-nilly because they're part of the coalition, that's it. In these days, that would mean as if Ukraine would be training some Belarus officers, knowing that there are missiles being fired from their territory, and there is a chance they may actually go join. So there is some wisdom in decisions, and you need to be thinking them through. Another statement from the chat: Israel is a much more adult and mature country than Ukraine. Not just historically, but even in recent history, we have already 74 years of independence and our own history, when Ukraine has much less than that. So I enjoy conversation with you. I enjoy talking to a person who uses his wits fast. And oh yeah, I also suffer. It's my personal grief from the main calmer and pacifier of Ukraine. In Ukraine, I do suffer from a whole class of people who are missing the speed of thinking. But yes, they are the ones who would say that, but Israel ambassador needs to say that Bandera was a good man in the stream. Here's a good suggestion. Build your own Ukrainian anti-air system, call it Bandera or Shukhevich, and if they're good and effective, it'll be in the news all over. If you keep hearing that anti-air system Shukhevich or Bandera destroyed 25 Russian missiles, the whole world will be applauding to Bandera. So, if we actually manage to creatively change the situation this way, instead of just crying over our kids who are being killed by Russian missiles in Vinnytsia and other towns, and if we can guarantee other countries that it's okay to invest in our country, that we provide a superior protection and nothing can reach you, then we'll reach very different results. So, in the meantime, we can at least talk to the ambassador and discuss certain things we can learn from Israel. And there's still a lot for us to learn and do to become a strong country. Thank you, Olexiy, who was a sort of a camera tone to that stream, and leave your likes.